Welcome to a new episode of the Tolkien Experience podcast. I'm Luke Shelton.
I'm Sarah Westvick.
And I'm Sarah Brown.
Each episode, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guests to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
All of this is made possible by our supporters on Patreon. So we want to thank them and encourage you to check out the community at patreon.com/Tolkien Experience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any more delay, let me introduce our guest. For this episode, I had the opportunity to speak with my good friend and a brilliant Tolkien scholar, Mariana Rios Maldonado. Mariana is a PhD student at the University of Glasgow, where she's interested in ethics, feminist theory, and encountering the other in Tolkien's works. She received a grant from the National Council for Science and Technology and the National Foundation for Fine Arts and Literature in Mexico for her studies. She also serves as the Equality and Diversity Officer for the University of Glasgow's Center for Fantasy and the Fantastic. In addition to all of her engagement with the University of Glasgow, she also holds a position on the editorial review board of Mallorn, the journal of the Tolkien Society. With all of these credentials in mind, I am delighted to welcome Mariana for our interview today. So without any more delay, let's get right into our questions. So Mariana, how were you first introduced to Tolkien's work?
It's a good story, or maybe it's a good timeline and it has different parts. So when I first became aware of Tolkien was thanks to my dad, because my dad is an absolute fan. So he read The Hobbit and read The Lord of the Rings in Spanish. I mean, I'm Mexican, in case that's good to say. And when he was very young, apparently in the movie theater, the only movie theater that existed in the very small city where my parents still live. Now, this is northern Mexico. It's 8 hours away from Mexico City. They were screening the Hobbit movie from way back when, which I knew about that movie ever since I was born, and it became one of my favorite movies as a child. And my dad would read me The Hobbit. Now, the thing is that when we moved to the United States, so my dad was doing his PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. And one of the very early memories that I have is my dad, he knows English from a scientific perspective. And also he learned English with the Beatles. So he made a point to himself to read The Lord of the Rings in English while he was doing his PhD. So one of my very early memories is seeing my dad trying to read The Lord of the Rings with his knowledge of English. And next to it was a very big sort of Merriam-Webster dictionary. Because he wasn't used to the literary language. So just seeing my dad at around 10 p.m. just trying to read The Lord of the Rings and then looking up all of these words. So with these 2 books. And I remember that he tried to get me into watching the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings. But to be honest, in the beginning, I didn't get it. I don't think that my mind was developed enough to understand the intricacies of the story, but I always knew what it was about. And it wasn't until one day we were at a movie theater and the trailer comes on for the Peter Jackson films. And my dad completely loses it. He's sitting next to me and the minute the trailer starts, it's a very iconic trailer, and he just starts squeezing my hand really hard, and just you could hear him next to me going and that it was that's why I say it's always been a part of my life, really, thanks to my dad. And I think I started reading, so I'd already read The Hobbit, and I started reading The Lord of the Rings I think when I was about 12 or 13. Yeah. So yeah, but like I said, there's a timeline.
Yeah. So I know that you've done master's level work and now you're doing PhD level work focusing on Tolkien. I'm wondering, if it's not too personal a question, how does your dad feel about you studying Tolkien to this level?
Oh, he's the person that has most supported me in being an academic and pursuing this path. So he's an academic himself, but he does something completely different, which is nuclear physics.
Oh,
so,
wow.
Completely different. But him and my mom have always been readers. So I've always grew up around books. And when I, first said that I wanted to study literature, especially he was like the person that most took it to heart to find a way to support me in that sort of journey. And like when I did my master's, I did my master's in Germany. And at first he was like, he didn't necessarily understand how that fit into the big Tolkien project, because I always knew that I wanted to do a PhD on Tolkien. Like ever since I was like 14, I knew that that's what I wanted to do. But going to Germany opened my eyes to a lot of the influences in Tolkien's work from, that mythical, for some researchers, archetypal sources that influence Tolkien, like Old Norse or Germanic cultures. And it was readily available there in Germany. And now, like with the PhD, I think it has to be said as a reality. So for those of you who don't necessarily know me or necessarily know the process of studying in academia in the UK, this is something, it's very expensive, especially if you are an overseas student. Brexit has changed that a bit. But as an overseas student, you're looking at a tuition of thousands of pounds per year. And the fact that my dad and my mom impulsed me to keep on trying and find sources of funding, and they even said, if this is your dream and if someday we're in the position where we could economically help you, and instead of asking me to desist because of the economic hardship, and mind you, we aren't wealthy, they're really hardworking people. So for me, it's like that support, that understanding that you need to fulfill this dream, and if you have to do that somewhere else, and we know that it costs money and etc., like that is just amazing. And he's still they're still my number one fans in everything that I've done related to this. So yeah, I'm very fortunate in that sense, very fortunate.
That's so heartwarming. I'm so happy that you have that connection. It sounds wonderful. So thinking back about the different experiences of Tolkien's work that you mentioned throughout your journey to grow in your fandom of Tolkien, which one stands out to you as maybe your favorite time or experience of Tolkien's work, or maybe even an adaptation?
That's a very good question, because sometimes it depends on the moment. It depends on the hour of the day. It depends on what I'm personally going through. So I think I always enjoyed the Peter Jackson films. And they became something sort of it's something that I'll watch when I'm sad. It's something that I'll watch when I want to celebrate my birthday. It's something that I'll watch on Christmas. So there's always sort of a lot of positive feelings attached to that adaptation or that interpretation, just because of, that what it meant in the history of entertainment and cinema. That for the first time, somebody had embarked themselves on such a large project to portray Middle Earth. And I still remember how I felt thinking that was impossible, and now you have this multi-million-dollar Amazon series. How long have we come? But I think my favorite, and it's not, it is a personal question, but I think it is important also to talk about personal things, especially because you don't know who's on the other side listening, and this might help. But so I have chronic depression and general anxiety disorder. And I've always had that since I was a child. And sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. But I had a really, really major mental health crisis, I would say probably in 2016. And I knew that I wanted to do a PhD, but I was very much in that depressive cycle of not knowing what the whole point was of, my dreams or my existence on Earth. Just to me, it all seemed pointless. And obviously, this happened while I was living in Germany. And my parents in Mexico they were very concerned and very worried, because the only thing that we could do really was do video calls and Skyping. And so obviously trying to hold on, they're trying to help me out. And then one day that I was particularly struggling, my dad just, asked me, because I was like, what's the point? Like, why should I even try to apply for a PhD? I don't feel like this is helping anybody out in the world. I don't think that, And then my dad just, like, very simply, because infinite knowledge, he just looked at me and said, do you think that reading Tolkien has made your life better? And I just stood there and I was like, yeah. And then he said, that's a reason enough to start studying him. I was like, you're right. So I think that's still like that moment where, it's something that you love and it's something that you feel passionate, and it's a light in those darkest days. And that's reason enough. That's reason enough. So that for me is my favorite memory.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. You never shared that story with me before, and I just really feel how impactful that is. So I really appreciate you sharing it with us. If you don't mind, I'd like to kind of relate for a moment, if I can.
Yeah, of course.
There was a time over the past year, it's been really hard for a lot of people. And my family was hit really, really hard by coronavirus. I lost 2 grandparents and an uncle to the virus, and also in the course of this year lost my 2 other grandparents. So I lost all 4 grandparents in a year. And I just so happened to be reading through The Lord of the Rings with a student over the course of this year. And there are just some moments where, for some reason, the lines from the story echo through your life. And there were 2 real big moments that did this for me this time around. There was the death of Aragorn in the appendices, where as he dies, Luthien is screaming Estelle, Estelle, which is his name, but it also means hope. So just that great contrast of the death of Aragorn, but at the same time clamoring for hope, and hope still being there in a way. And that really resonated with the scene where Sam is remembering that the shadow is just a passing thing in Mordor, when he sees the stars up above in the sky that are untouched by the shadow. And so just like you're talking about, even through the hard times of this last year, the work itself really was a kind of a balm in a lot of ways. It helped me process a lot of emotions that, we're in quarantine for most of the year. I couldn't really talk to people, just like you were kind of separated in Germany. We moved here like a year before quarantine, so I don't really have any local friends. So yeah, trying to process those things through Skype is very difficult. And so just to have a different voice, and Tolkien's voice particularly, was really impactful. And I just really appreciate your observation of that personal impact is what makes Tolkien worth coming back to and worth studying. I think that's a brilliant insight. So absolute credit to you and to your father for for having that insight.
Yeah, and I have to thank you at the same time, because remembering that passage, it hadn't clicked to me that Arwen is crying out hope, and especially after Aragorn's parting words are something like, "We're not forever bound to the circles of the world." Mm-hmm. Like there is something beyond, and that hope, whatever that means for people, it might not necessarily be the experience of death, but there is something beyond, and the hope of being able to transcend to that, and that experience of being able to transcend grief and loss and hardship. And it's and I think for a lot of readers who find that quality in Tolkien's works, it has been of a monumental impact, especially in the last year and a half. Like, I think for me also, what I love about especially The Lord of the Rings is that here's partly the story of two very small, insignificant, weak beings who have furry feetses inching their way to try to make change. And it's just like all the odds are against them. And there is no lying that they come back and they're completely, especially Frodo, he's traumatized. He'll never be the same. But yet, there is that, even if the odds are against you, and even if it might be, that anticipation of doom, that you may not survive, you may not make it, it might not make a difference, but still trying. Like, I think for me, that's still, especially today, especially in the world that we're living in, it's just knowing that defeat is imminent is not a good enough reason to not try. You still have to try. Yeah,
absolutely. All right, I have officially gotten us sidetracked from from the discussion questions, but it was a brilliant conversation. So thank you for sharing so much. So going back to this idea of how you've been around Tolkien your whole life, and you've come back to it in different ways and appreciating different adaptations. Do you feel like over the course of being exposed young and then going on to do academic work, do you feel like the way that you've approached Tolkien has changed over time?
Definitely. I think it's just this it's a complex question because, I've also changed. And I think any reader who has a favorite book, you're not the same person throughout your life, and you'll find different things that you agree or you disagree, or you like or you dislike. And I think, for example, the one thing that Tolkien's works still offer me is, at a very emotional level, I think it's hope. And also, I would say the motivation to keep doing things. I think that is what I feel has been constantly present. But at the same time, for example, as I've grown older, and also as I've been in contact with more people who are readers of Tolkien and came to his texts in different ways than mine, they're not only different individually, but their paths have been different. And being able to hear those stories and understanding, their feelings and their opinions, like that also has changed my perspective to a point where I see Tolkien as a human. Like I once saw somebody on Twitter writing, he was a hot mess. And I think it's true. And especially obviously I'm saying this as, so just a little backstory so people know where I'm coming from. I was born in Mexico, but I grew up part of my childhood in the United States. And although I had a history of immigration, it wasn't really until I went to Germany and I saw how differently I was being treated that it clicked to me what the immigration or migrant experience was. Mm-hmm. And despite that, I always found Tolkien's works relatable. Like, they still spoke to me. I didn't feel alienated from that world, so to speak. But now in the PhD, and especially with contact with other Tolkien scholars who are also BIPOC scholars and readers, and I realize, you know what? That was just my experience. It wasn't their experience. And they do have a right to talk about these feelings, to talk about, you know, representation and what that means, and to wonder who fits where in Middle Earth. And I think that that has made me like question a lot of the assumptions that I used to have about these texts. And it's able to come to that sort of conclusion, that peaceful agreement, to be at peace with how complex and at times so insightful and enlightening, but maybe perhaps also problematic piece of work. That's art, you know? So I think that that's definitely what has happened to me in the past, I would say, couple of months, past couple of years, you know, realizing that the experience of reading Tolkien is so much more than just me with that text. And it's important to listen and to make space to these people that isn't like, they're not yourself. So that's what I mean.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I appreciate you modeling, making that space, because it's so important, especially for, people like me who basically society tells me all day long, I shouldn't make that space. I should take up the space because I'm the straight white man in the room. So here we go, you know? But I have also been learning along in about that same timeline of really reflecting on the difference between assuming that my responses are universal,
exactly,
versus assuming that my responses are just shared by other people to differing degrees. And I love the way that you phrased that, you know, those different interpretations just demonstrate more complexity in the work. I think that's absolutely true. Because if we all walk away from the work with the same impression of the work, guess what? We stop talking about it. And it becomes something like, not to deride another work, but it becomes something like an Aesop's fable, where it's just a story that we're told as kids, and then we kind of move on because there's nothing else to the story. We're told what the moral is, and then we can just say, oh, well, that was fun. Let's put it away now. And so I think it's really important to understand that complexity is what makes the work so wonderful, and it's what makes it so relevant even today. Is we do have new interpretations and new areas to explore, because that keeps it alive. So I really like the way that you phrase that of the different interpretations demonstrating the complexity of the work. I should probably clarify, that's not to say that all of the complexities are good, because there are certainly areas of complexity where we can talk about, are certain depictions racially coded, or are there racial problems here? And that's certainly not good that Tolkien included that. But it does allow for more diverse interpretations, which ultimately, I think, helps us as individuals. Like we were talking about earlier, it helps us form and converse important ideas in the world. And I think that ultimately is beneficial, but it being in the work itself isn't a good in and of itself, I would say, if that makes sense.
I think, no, I completely agree with you. And that also makes me think, for example, of, um, it it strikes me sometimes as strange when people don't want to talk about the problematic aspects of, it can be Tolkien's fiction or any other fiction for that matter, as if that in some way would take away from its value. Now, I know that I have to be more or less like, I have to explain this. It's just that I don't know if it's something personal or if it's cultural, but I think that when you encounter problematic elements and you realize that they're there, it's also your responsibility to talk about them head on, understand where they're coming from, understand why they're happening, and, because otherwise turning a blind eye sort of perpetuates this, I don't know, this is what I feel sometimes as an uncomfortable silence, or there's an elephant in the room and everybody notices that something is going around, but it would seem inappropriate or impolite to talk about it. And I think especially now in 2021, it is possible to say with a work like The Lord of the Rings, it has inspired millions of people to do good and to reconsider their role on Earth. And at the same time, it has been one of the favorite literary works of neo-fascist movements. And it is possible. And we have to talk about both of them. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's something, that this work of art should completely be, I don't know, obliterated from human history. It means that there's something there that is complex, that is heartwarming, and that can be and it can be troubling. And when I say it's okay, it means that is human existence. We are contradictory, complex, hot messes. And so are the things that we create, and being able to talk about those things and acknowledging them and the responses that they create, like, at least that's how I perceive it. A lot of people online, as we have seen recently, disagree, and it's fine. Like, that's your opinion. And in the free market of opinions, you can say your piece and that's fine. But this is just the perspective where I'm coming from. Like, I think let's talk about it. We need to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I 100% agree with that. And I think everyone is welcome to their opinion, but what I don't understand is, why can't the people who try to shut down the conversation? It's like, why can't we have the conversation? Let's have the conversation. Because you often find, well, I shouldn't say that. You sometimes find people online who, when you bring up the problematic aspects of Tolkien, their knee-jerk reaction is, it isn't there, and stop talking about it. And it's like, what's the harm in just talking about it? No, because, I mean, the people who are talking about this, generally speaking, are the ones who care about The Lord of the Rings. Very few of the people that I've encountered having these conversations are the people who want to, quote unquote, cancel Tolkien. And so I don't understand the rush to just shut it down and not talk about these things. Because I think, like we've been talking about this whole time, those conversations are important, and Tolkien can help navigate important conversations, both centering Tolkien's work, like let's have a conversation about the problematic aspects in Tolkien's work, and decentering Tolkien's work of, okay, Tolkien's been in the middle for so long, here are the problems in it, let's look at other works or other authors and things and see how they deal with these same aspects, and see how there's an interplay between, or evolution of, or exchange of ideas in the fantasy genre or in genre fiction, those kinds of things. And so I don't know if, how do you trying to phrase this as a question that's not like a yes or no question. I want to get your opinions. How do you feel like we can use Tolkien to engage when there are certain aspects of the fandom who don't want that? Is that something where we just say, okay, you go sit in the corner and we'll have the conversations ourselves? Or do you invite them into the conversation in a limited capacity? Or how do you think we should deal with that?
I think that's a very good question. I don't necessarily know that there is like a straight answer to it. So I think, like, first off, like beginning to, for example, why do certain people want to shut down these conversations? I think this is just like my theory. This is my interpretation, and I could be completely wrong. But the people that I have encountered and that have a problem with either, this being able to say Tolkien had as a person, had problematic aspects in his persona. Like, I don't know, he either racist, sexist, misogynist, homophobic. I'm not necessarily saying that this is true. I'm saying these are, for example, the things that you're not supposed to say according to this group of people. Mm-hmm. And then there's also, for example, being able to say, okay, so The Lord of the Rings, and I'm going to use just The Lord of the Rings because it's the most well-known work. Mm-hmm. It has problematic representations of race and gender. So I feel that the people who have this sort of knee-jerk reaction of saying that's not true and we're not going to talk about it sometimes conflate their passion or their love of these works with a criticism to their own persona. That is, if you like Tolkien or if you like Lord of the Rings and somebody says that's problematic, then you're problematic, then you're racist, then you're misogynist. And I think that the reality is much more complex than that, and it's trying to, for people to understand that you can be critical of a work and still love it. And those two things can go together hand in hand. And also because right now when we see people talk about cancel culture, I think that there's a problem with not understanding that canceling, at least in my opinion, it's not a thing. It's about holding people and institutions and structures accountable for the systemic oppression that they enact. So in that case, there's nothing wrong with saying, yes, Tolkien reflected his worldview in his text, and we've come beyond that. And you know what? He never intended for his text to be at the center of whatever type of fantasy canon people wanted to construct. He did it for his own very personal reasons, and fame came along and other people made him the center, and here we are now. But it doesn't have to stay that way. And if we have works that are completely different or opposite or whatever to Tolkien, the world is big and wide enough for these two, for these things to coexist and for people to read both of them and be happy. Like, the existence of these works that are different doesn't demerit any sort of value that Tolkien or his works have. That's like, and obviously with a lot of the things that I just said, I'm trying to explain it in a very simple way, but it is very complex. And it also depends on, I don't know, the perspective from which people are coming from. Like, there is obviously, that sort of personal attachment of, I love Lord of the Rings, and now people are telling me that, it has problematic representations. Does that make me problematic? Like, that's on one level, But then, I don't know, on another level, I'm trying to think because there's so many different examples of how that works. It's like entire course structures have been created thinking about Tolkien in mind. And now they're saying, you know what, maybe it's time to move past it. How do I, as a researcher, understand and adapt? And that, like, it's hard and it's difficult. And it also requires you to a certain extent to deconstruct those ideas that you have of value, of what's problematic, of even your idea of Tolkien. Like, it can be fine if Tolkien is still your personal hero. That doesn't mean that he didn't make mistakes. So it's just, what I'm trying to say is that being able to amplify your vision to the complexities of a work and of a person is a good thing. And reminding yourself that, it's not all inherently bad and it's not all inherently good. And the work is trying to understand that. So, and I mean, I know that this is kind of a very much all over the place answer, but those are my thoughts right now about it.
Yeah, I think you've said a lot of really, really important things and made some great observations there. It kind of reminds me of, to kind of put a little metaphor in, and you can tell me if I've messed things up, but how when you first start making friends, when you're younger, you just make friends that make you feel happy. You just associate with people that you're happy with and happy around, and that you make them feel happy too. And that's what being a friend means. But as you get older, you start to realize, if that's all being a friend means, then my friendships are very shallow. And I can't talk to those friends about problems I'm having or when I'm feeling blue, because they don't want to hear that. So as you get older and more mature in your relationship, you start to find those people who are your friends when you're not happy, or are your friend when they're not happy. And that's a more rich relationship in a lot of ways, because it allows us to be more honest with them throughout our life. And to me, that's kind of the same process with a work that you love. Like, sure, you fall in love with it because it's a wonderful work and you appreciate what it's doing and it's rocking your world in the moment. But if you want to keep engaging with that work, it requires you to explore that relationship a bit further than just, I like this book a lot, which, I mean, if that's the level you want to stay at, that's great. Like, I have books that I don't want to dig too deeply into, but at the same time, I'm not going to shut down other people having conversations about those books because they're going into a deeper relationship with that book than I am.
I completely agree. And it's actually, that's a really good metaphor. It's like, because obviously when you get older, you perceive friendships differently, your emotional needs are different. You don't necessarily have to stay with the same group of people, and yet you'll have fond memories of them, and that's perfectly fine. And it's just like, let's say that these friends are the Tolkien fandom that we're talking about that try to shut down the conversation. So do you try to include them? Do you try to, keep them at bay? And I think it depends also on your experience. And I'm saying this also taking into consideration the race angle and my own experience, dealing with these people online or in conferences. I have to say that I'm very fortunate. I've experienced minimum nastiness, and I also have, I think, sufficiently acid sense of humor not to take it seriously. But that's just me. I know people that have had horrible experiences with fandom online. And I think if people make the personal decision to not engage because that's unhealthy and it feels unsafe, that's perfectly fine. And that's perfectly respectable. For all of those that still are in that position to, sort of like filter these conversations, so try to continue that dialogue with those certain groups of people or factions that, refuse to give that space or refuse to acknowledge those ideas. then I think it's up to us to try to maintain, a respectful sort of like dialogue. I do believe dialogue, but that involves obviously understanding or noticing if the other person is willing to listen. I think it's a two-way thing. So I don't think that these people should be completely shunned, because people can change. I think about like, Dad, if you're watching this, hi, sorry, I'm going to use this as an example, but my dad is still a 60-year-old Mexican man. So some things related to gender or the LGBTQ community escape him. And, very much a man that grew up in a very patriarchal society, patriarchal family, So there are a lot of things that I would say go beyond him. That doesn't mean that one cannot say, hey, what you said or what you did is not okay. And he's still trying to learn. So there is that possibility, like being open to, even if at first it might cause, like shock or that knee-jerk reaction. But that can happen, and people can change, and people can open themselves, But if people, if there are people who want to shut down these conversations and also do it in a very aggressive and violent manner, I don't think they should, like, there's no need to tolerate them. Like, there's a difference between, establishing that dialogue and enduring abuse when trying to, facilitate these conversations. And it's a very fine line. It's very complex, and there's so many nuances. So I do think that, like I said, there's no concrete answer. It depends on your position and where you're coming from and where you are at in life. Just being honest with that and understanding that, the people can change, and if they don't want to listen, that's also fine, and creating also like those boundaries are okay, and boundaries are healthy. And if a part of the Tolkien fandom doesn't want to get on board with this, fine. Our existence won't be the worse or the lesser because of that. Very honest opinion.
Yeah, I think you said a lot of really insightful things there. I do think that your final note about boundaries is really helpful. Like, particularly on the internet, where we have, there's one Tolkien scholar who she talks about it as having the someone's wrong about something on the internet impulse to like go and correct it. But realizing that if it's someone you don't know and they don't know you, the chances that they're going to consider your approach and opinion are very slim. And so realizing, okay, if I'm going to have this conversation, I need to know where my boundary is. Where am I not going to go? When does it get too emotional, hurtful, possibly damaging to me, so that I just walk away? Whereas your example is a great example of, your example of your dad is a great example of having a conversation with someone you're close to and you really care about. The boundary is, in those kinds of conversations, can be much more forgiving because you know much more about each other. You actually care for each other outside of this conversation. And so it enables you to have those conversations in a much more meaningful way, I find, in that, like, you're able to say, hey, I know you're a good person otherwise, but in this one thing, let's talk about this, whereas online, it's so often I've never met you before, but you're wrong about this. And I feel like that makes it very difficult to have open conversations.
Yeah, and it's like you don't know where the other person is coming from. You don't know their life experience or what impulsed them to say those type of things. But, and I think there's also conversation to be had as, well, I'm coming from an academic perspective. And also, like, I'm from the older generation of millennials, which means for me, social media has never played an important part of my life. Not really. And I see newer generations of academics and the way academia is being pushed towards, also embracing that form of communication, through Twitter. There's so much networking going on Twitter. And, academics trying to make their research more approachable through TikTok. And like, these are just very random examples, And all of that is valid. But obviously, we're entering into a time where we're having to deal with certain, behaviors and responses that nobody really ever taught us how to, or where how to deal with this. Like, it didn't necessarily come with a manual, And so if you're a young academic trying to make it out there, sharing your research online on Twitter, and you have a public account, you might encounter somebody that's going to be completely awful, and tries to shut you down. And that's one of the risks, and I think it's really sad and it's really horrible that people have to endure that type of hate. And obviously that's not okay, and just learning how to manage it and how to, be able to say maybe from that perspective, to what extent am I going to involve myself with these comments, with these people? And some people will and want to, and other people won't, and that's perfectly fine. And there's also the other side of like, well, where is the ethical responsibility of the people that actually put those messages or those comments out there? And it's like, why are you doing this? What are you trying to achieve? What stirred you or ignited you that you think that behind the face of anonymity, it's okay to go to someone and say, hey, and then something very hurtful or insulting or damaging? It's like, it's those two sides. Now, then we can also have another conversation about social media policies and the companies that run them, but that's for another day. But I think a lot about that, and especially because academia becomes a thing where, I don't know, maybe people who are outside of the academic sphere don't realize it, but it becomes kind of like your persona, your identity. And the way that this, neoliberalist, post-capitalist world works, it's like there's this constant, pushing to put yourself out there and your research and your ideas and being, interesting and funny and doing this and doing that because, you want to be perceived, cherished, and known in the field. And that's great. But it also comes with a lot of huge downsides that a lot of people have experienced, especially if, you are a woman, if you're queer, if you're disabled, or if you're a person of color. Like those are like, and that's really difficult. And I've experienced it a tiny bit myself, but I do think that it's super important to have that conversation like we're having it right now, just because of the role that it's playing out in our lives as we speak.
Yeah, absolutely. So I cherish this conversation that we're having, and I appreciate it so much. But at the same time, we do have a limited amount of time for our episode. So I do need to move us into our last question. But it does still touch on a lot of the things that we've been discussing. So you've told us so much about your love and passion for The Lord of the Rings, and then we've talked a lot about some of the conflict that has arisen both in the reading itself and in the fandom. So at this point, do you ever find that you recommend Tolkien's work, and why or why not?
I do because for me personally, it's like I can, on the most deep and profound level, I can tell you it made me a better person. But on the most superficial level, it's like, I really enjoy doing that around Christmas and it's fun. And, like, I love the song on the Prancing Pony. And it's like, just for entertainment. I think for me, it's more of a question of, even though I'm a Tolkien scholar, and even though Tolkien is my favorite author and my favorite book is Lord of the Rings, I don't expect people to love it as much as I do, and that's fine. You know, like nobody has an obligation of loving anything, like any work of art in this world, even though I love it as much. But when people ask me, would you recommend Tolkien? I'd be like, yeah, just go at it, you know, with an open mind. And sometimes it is like, I think in my experience and the people that I know that have tried to read Tolkien, especially later in life, it's normally either a hit or a miss. Either people are completely immersed in it, or they're like, you know what, I don't get it. What's taking them so long to leave the Shire? And, you know, like, I don't get why Tom Bombadil? Why? So I think it's just knowing that the world will be full of people that, you know, will like it and cherish it and appreciate it. And some people won't, and that's perfectly fine. Like, I think we also have to, especially in our field and our love of scholar, it's also important to demystify it. It's like, it is, for some of us, it has been sort of like that passion and that motivation. And for other people, it won't. And you know what? The world's big enough for both of us, and that's perfectly fine. And I just hope the Amazon series is good, because I have thoughts.
I agree. So one last thing, are you working on anything right now that our listeners, our watchers can engage with, can follow along with, can interact with?
I mean, I'm writing my thesis, so I'm on Twitter, and I sometimes comment on the process that it is and sort of like my thoughts. Right now, I'm actually in the end stages of my PhD, so I am, like, you know, doing that a lot. As in, that's basically what I'm doing right now. So the end product won't be ready until probably next year. But what I can say is that right now, what I've been working on as what I've been reading and using for my research, and maybe if people want to, you know, hit me up and talk about it. I've been reading lately the anthology Perilous and Fair, which is an anthology. For those who want to Google it up, it's basically about women and the works of Tolkien. So my thoughts have to do a lot right now on, you know, what it is like women in Middle Earth, the feminine, the femininity aspect, sort of like, you know, that's where right now my research is going. That's where I'm dipping my toes in. And it's something that I love talking about it. So if anybody wants to hit me up on Twitter, I'm there.
Yeah.
That's it. Like, I think a lot of people don't know this, but sometimes PhD work is like, you won't see the fruits of this until like 3 years after, and maybe you might be published and maybe not. But yeah, that's where I'm at right now.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a wonderful chance to get to talk to you again, and I appreciate you being our guest so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I really enjoyed this. It's so nice to be able to talk about, you know, just Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and everything in such an open and honest way, where you feel like really supportive and encouraged to talk about your feelings and your thoughts. And I hope that for anybody that sees this, you know, that would like to be part of the conversation, Luke, obviously, thank you for having me. And it's just such a wonderful project that you have. I think the Tolkien experience, the Tolkien world is a better place also because Luke is in it. And I say this as a person who has known him for a couple of years now. So I really cherish the effort and, you know, his insight and voice. And I'm very honored, very humbled to be part of this. And I also hope that if we were able to touch anybody out there who might want to consider a career studying Tolkien, or who, wants to have a say in this conversation, and, we're also here for that. So thank you, and thanks to everybody listening.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We really enjoy making these podcasts, and the fun doesn't stop here.
That's right, it continues on social media. You can find us on Facebook as Tolkien Experience and Twitter as @TolkienEXP. Don't forget to like, follow, share and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking to our guests.
For even more content and to join our fellowship of supporters, check out our Patreon by going to patreon.com/Tolkien Experience. Finally, you can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I'm @LukeB.Shelton.
I'm @SR.Westvic.
And I'm @Aaron L. Palmadill. If you have questions or comments, you can send them to us by email at tolkienexperience@gmail.com.
If you want to know more about this week's guest, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, and we truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.